Hope you enjoyed your June break. But we're getting the meetings back into swing, and as you'll see before the end of the meeting, we've got a lot of jam-packed stuff coming up for the rest of the year. But today, the focus really needs to be on the establishment of the Equity Advisory Panel and the Technical Advisory Group. I don't think, see if, has Kevin joined us? Kevin, are you on? I don't think he's been able to join us yet. So he wanted to put out, for those of you who are subrecipients, he wanted to put out a reminder. He needs invoices and reports for you. Thank you all. With the cities and county, I've gotten all my in-kind match reporting, so that is done, much appreciated. And we'll get those Q3 reports in. I do want to, before we launch in fully, want to give acknowledgement. We have a new member to our steering committee. Ben Carr is joining us today. He's the new building official with Avondale, and Avondale is one of our partners, and just like to welcome Ben to the meeting for the first time. And I'm sure, Ben, you'll see a few names you know. This group is a blend of for the grant itself, the cities that were committed to the initial application, as well as the sub-recipients of the grant funds and the state energy offices. So this is really the group that has, the most stake in the project. And so this is the group that's kind of guiding the process forward. So as I said, we're going to focus on the Equity Advisory Panel and Technical Advisory Group today. And I'd sent out this question to everyone, and hopefully you had a little chance to think about it, because we want to make sure that however we're establishing these two groups, we're getting the most benefit from them in terms of how they're structured and how they operate, but we're also providing the most benefit to them in terms of hearing their input and the issues and the knowledge and expertise they can bring to the table. So the core team has been meeting for the last week to kind of brainstorm around an overall advisory structure and proposed function for the committees. I'm going to run through that really quickly. Please feel free to interject and provide input on that. But then we do want to have a brainstorming session with you all around selection criteria. So please, when we get to that point, I'm hoping everyone will participate, because your thoughts on the kinds of criteria we need to make those selections for the committee are really, really important to make sure we have the kind of representation that you feel is important. We'll touch on the timeline for getting those two committees established, and then talk about what's going to be unrolling for the rest of the year. Like I said, moving forward, now that we have the award in place, it's going to be pretty action-packed at these meetings. So there's a lot we're going to cover, and we just wanted to give you kind of an initial heads up about what that will look like. So without further ado, and I'm not doing this in PowerPoint format, so apologies for that, but I think this will be a little easier just to kind of operate. So with our initial discussions, what the core team had talked about was, we have a lot of input that's coming into the process. We've looked at and talked about the surveys that are going out to the building departments. There's going to be interviews on top of that. There's community engagement sessions that LISC and their team is going to be leading, as well as direct engagement by community-based organizations that will be subcontracted to LISCs. So there's a lot of input that's coming into this process. We have these advisory groups that we need to establish. We've committed to doing the equity panel, as well as a technical advisory group. This group determined we also needed a more kind of hands-on code development working group to support the tag. So it's kind of they're linked together. So, but in total, 3 advisory groups we're looking at, and then we've got a range of deliverables. And so, as the core team was talking this through, we really wanted to not just understand the throughput of this process, but also really kind of understand the relationship between the EAP and the tag more clearly, as well as what they're doing individually. And also, we've got specific deliverables that are coming out of this project, but at the same time, there's going to be a lot of things that are raised throughout this community engagement that may be out of the scope of what we're trying to do. And rather than just ignoring that, we wanted to think of ways to try to acknowledge all the input that comes into this process, regardless of whether it can go into the Regional Resilience Code, which is, I'm apologizing, I'm starting to get into acronyms here. So the Regional Resilience Code is the building code we're developing. The Net Zero Roadmap is the NZR. And then, of course, implementations and resources and community resources. So we started, because it's so important to make sure that we value the input of these advisory groups, we decided to start with the deliverables themselves and work back from there and say, what is it in what we've committed to DOE that we really need and want their input on? And it's not all the deliverables. Some of them are process-based, some of them are kind of internal things that we need to be doing, like project management. So we captured, it's about half of the overall deliverables. We captured the deliverables that we really think are most relevant to where we need input from these 2 groups. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but really it kind of revolves around, the technical deliverables that we're trying to produce, and the community engagement process and how that input is used, and then the ultimate kind of supporting resources that are developed at the end, including some of the education opportunities. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This was my initial logic model that kind of is another view at saying, hey, we've got this community input into the process. It's coming into these 2 advisory groups. And then we're trying to figure out like what kinds of input and what kind of buckets that look like. So the next 3 slides I put together just to focus on a couple key things. So we've been thinking about like what the relationship between the EAP and the tag are, or could be. We've also thought about the roles of each of them individually, which is the last thing I'm going to get to, because I think it's a better launching off point to talk about selection criteria. But we've also been trying to think about what are these buckets? What are the kinds of input and where could it potentially go, so that we're, honoring everything that comes out of this process. So first off, the relationship between the Equity Advisory Panel and the Technical Advisory Group. So we're envisioning the Equity Advisory Panel is really going to be the recipient of a lot of that community input, as well as generating their own thoughts about how to advance equity and resilience in the built environment. And we're intentionally framing this a little more broadly than just buildings or building code, because we think there's a lot of opportunity, especially when you think about the Net Zero Roadmap, to think outside of just the building itself and the building code itself. We do want them to try to focus on, the deliverable part of it, but we understand that there's going to be things that are outside of the scope that come out through this input process. And so the Equity Advisory Panel will then, they'll provide input, make recommendations to the Technical Advisory Group. And the Technical Advisory Group, while they're first and foremost going to be focused on the Regional Resilience Code, we also envision them having a little bit of a sorting role in terms of determining, as that input comes in, what can be addressed in the building code. And if it can't be addressed within the building code, but it's relevant to resilience and equity in the built environment, say something around land use codes, and it's, you know, within the purview of local government, then that can go into the net zero roadmap. And then also figuring out just what is out of scope for that. And then providing that, you know, perspective, that recommendation back to the equity advisory panel. So this is kind of in general how we see this operating, is that interaction really being about like what are the issues we need to tackle and where do we tackle them, kind of process. Then let's talk about buckets. So there's, like you said, there's a lot of different input that we anticipate, and not all of it's going to be things that can go into the specific deliverables of the project. So we looked at this two different ways. One are the things that we've actually committed to DOE that we're going to do. Those are the things in the SOPO. That's the top, the orange part of it. But there are additional opportunities that this project presents, and how do we look at input and ideas and things that fall outside of those committed deliverables, but we have an opportunity to acknowledge, even if we can't directly address. So, and this is a lot of the role that the TAG is going to play, with, of course, support from the technical partners and even this group as needed. So there will be input around that will be specific to what does resilience and equity look like in a building code. Anything that is relevant to the building code will go to the code development working group and be part of the regional resilience code in some form or fashion. So the TAG will really provide that high level, here are the considerations we need to take into account. The code development working group figures out the how. Then we're going to certainly have things that are out of scope of a building code, but are relevant to how we can, as jurisdictions, impact resilience and equity in the built environment. And that will really go to the Net Zero Roadmap, and that is owned by New Buildings Institute. And there may be some need to tweak. These are kind of really high level concepts. So I understand there's a need to kind of refine what exactly we mean here, but hopefully the generalization is clear enough. And then we committed to doing the implementation guide. So anything that comes out of this process that's related to implementation will go to be considered for the implementation guide, and that's under the purview of the Institute for Energy Solutions, or IES. Then in terms of additional opportunities and considerations, there are going to probably be instances where the TAG feels that there needs to be more information or some kind of analysis to support their decision making. PNNL, the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, has committed some amount of technical assistance. It is limited both in amount and in the scope of things they're willing to do. But this is also where we're really fortunate to have the Nature Conservancy Phoenix as a partner. They have a little bit of a budget and are really interested in particular in how to support kind of the information gap and analysis gap for this project. So as those needs for analysis or data or information arise, we've got two different places that those requests can go. Then there's going to be things that are just purely out of scope or the purview of local governments. If it is relevant to innovation and building codes, the plan is to deliver a set of recommendations to the Department of Energy to say, you know, these are things that are really important in how we think about tackling equity and resilience, but the way we do building codes or the way this operates now, there just isn't the mechanism to do it. And we recommend you look at that and how that could be different in the future. I don't really have a lot of specifics, but we just feel that they're going to be things that kind of are beyond the scope of what building codes currently allow or support. And maybe it's something like design considerations. Maybe there's a more expansive view of what life and safety means, life, health, and safety mean in a building code context. If they're out of scope and out of purview and cannot be addressed through building codes, DOE is pretty limited in their perspective. They really focus on building codes. The goal is we're going to create an out of scope kind of parking lot throughout the project. If there's any debate over whether something is in or out of scope, this body will be the determining body. You guys will make the decision about whether it's something that is in scope or out of scope. For everything that is out of scope and goes into that parking lot, IES will capture in some format in the meta study that they're already planning on doing, which really is going to help at the national level understanding the value of the process that we went through. So it's a really great opportunity for kind of lessons learned or identification of gaps or bigger needs that are outside of our project that can be brought to national attention. So I am going to pause there. I see I've got, oh yeah, Brianne noted, you could also bring some of those out of scope purview items to the National Energy Codes Collaborative. That's another great point, Brianne, thank you. Anybody else? I'm gonna take a pause here. Thoughts, concerns? How do folks feel about this as kind of the overall structure we're looking at?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for this. This was actually a helpful page to sort of show the overall view. I think one of the things that'd be exciting, like for the 24 people or so on the line, whatever, is actually to have sort of a straw dog of what some of the specific examples of things are. Like you spoke in general terms, like something to do with design or something, but actually to have some, like 5 things that are examples of things that we could think of, like, carbon intensity of materials and where that would go. And it's just have sort of, just because it's really hard to grasp onto, what some of these could be. And I think as we have a good sense of that, I think that'd be really helpful to kind of show here's all the buckets and here's some things that as an initial draft or initial take, what we're going to have in each bucket.
That's a really great suggestion, Mark. I kind of steered clear of getting into the specifics, but I think you're right. We're going to need to put some thought into, at least conceptually, what falls where. So let me noodle on that. If anyone, as we're sitting on the call, you'd mentioned like carbon intensity, Mark. If you can think of things that you think are going to come out of this process and you are interested in like how do we figure out what bucket they put in, pop them in the chat, because I think if you guys are generating the examples that you'd like to see kind of dispersed through this, that might help with the utility of having those examples. But I really appreciate that, Mark.
Yeah.
Jonathan, you had, oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to sort of respond to that. Yeah, I think because what I just see is we can all go like, yeah, this looks great. Yeah, let's go ahead. But then we have very different ideas of what all of these are. So,
Yeah.
we're not really getting consent. We think we're getting consensus. Everybody seemed to like this chart. Great. But it turns out as soon as we actually see practical examples, oh no, we don't want that in there. No, that's definitely should be in the parking lot, So I think that we're not really having consensus until we actually have some real examples here. So I think that'd be a good idea to just sort of compile one of some, the initial ones that maybe even the individual committees are going to review and consider, I think that'd be helpful.
That's great. And I'm seeing some pop up in the chat already. So if folks have like, I want to see where this fits in, please put it in because that'll make this just a more productive exercise. Right. Jonathan, I think you had your hand up real quick.
Oh, I think that your response there is really great. And I think just to maybe add a little bit more, I think there's to respond to the comment, or add a little bit more context to the comment. I think that what those things are is going to be a little bit hard to predict until we're actually like in the process and we see what happens, we see what comes through. But I can just share a very high level example from some previous experience with different groups that I've observed. But one is like the nature and the structure of the building code is such that, for better or for worse, we're really locked into a lot of prescriptive requirements, right? Like use this kind of window, right? Use this much insulation, use this type of, use roofing with this kind of material quality. And those are all like, sort of do this, not that kind of things. They're prescriptive guidelines. And for many years in the broader sort of building performance community, there has been a call to have a shift to a performance code that would only consider building performance. And so that would be an example of something that's like, we could debate the merits of whether or not that's a good approach or not. However, like there is no way in what we are doing that we're going to fundamentally reshape the nature of building codes as they've been adopted and implemented. So that to me is like, that's something that would be, I would argue, is out of scope, and that would kind of belong. It's a good idea potentially. It's something that would require more study, but that's the kind of thing that would go into this out of scope parking lot. And I think what the value of the process that's being outlined here and the idea that this information gets captured is, rather than saying like, oh yeah, that's a good idea, I think we can actually, and this was the role of the Institute for Energy Solutions in the meta study that Leslie referenced, that is independent of this process but aligned with it, is that we can actually then find really concrete, grounded examples of why this other approach is needed, or in what kinds of problems it would help solve. So I think we can imagine a range of these things that we're going to bump into or run into along this whole process. I think some of this stuff will really surprise us going forward. But I'm really happy to have that part of the process to make sure that we're not just sort of saying, oh yeah, that could be interesting, but actually be able to look at that and make sure that it doesn't get lost. So I just really am appreciative of this format and structure, and I think it's will also help our processes stay focused and on track and targeted to make change where we can in the immediate sort of near-term scope and honor the deliverables of the grant, but also set up the possibility for larger scale, bigger changes going forward, that will take more time and more effort to really realize. So I think that's sort of the intent and spirit of this diagram that we're looking at.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. Anyone else want to share thoughts on kind of the overall structure? Great. And I'm going to remind folks in slide after next, I'm expecting participation. And I have no problem calling on people. So I wanted to start with kind of these two pieces first, because I wanted to end with the third, which is really talking more about the uniqueness of the EAP and TAG. So we've talked a little bit about how we see them interacting. We've talked about kind of the overall flow and how information goes into different buckets. But before we get into kind of the selection criteria brainstorming, we wanted to just give you a little more clarity on the difference between the two. So the EAP, we are providing stipends. We want to make sure we get good representation, and we want to value the time of these individuals. And because we have budget for the stipends, it does limit us a bit in the overall membership. So we're really looking at 10, 12 max for this group. So when we get to the selection criteria, I want to start with the EAP, because I think this one might be the most challenging to figure out how we get the right kind of representation across. Remember, this is not just all of Arizona, but New Mexico as well, with that small of a group. The tag, we're not doing stipends, so a larger membership is feasible. And I actually just personally like the idea of a larger membership. I think there's a lot of topics, a lot of technical information that would be valuable to this discussion. And so, you know, making sure that we've got all the right people and the perspectives at the table is really, really key. And if we're not as limited with the size of the group, I think it behooves us to consider having a larger group. So the first bullets on each one really kind of just go back to underscore the EAP is going to be looking at this from a broader perspective. We're kind of going into this assuming they're not going to be building code experts. They're going to be much more broad and generalized in their knowledge. And so they're going to be kind of, their framing question is really, what does resilience and equity mean in the built environment, as opposed to the tag is really focused on what does resilience and equity mean in building codes. So that is kind of the inherent difference in that kind of focusing question. What that means for the tag in terms of like, what does resilience and equity mean in building codes? From that, they will also be making recommendations about what elements of code and standards need to be included in the RRC. So if we need this aspect of resilience, thermal comfort, say, what elements of the code support that? How do we get there? And then overall helping inform the scope of the regional resilience code, the net zero roadmap, and the implementation guide. So the actual deliverables based on this process of thinking through how does the code support these particular issues. The EAP, on the other hand, will have more of kind of an outward focus to both support the community engagement planning and implementation, as well as reviewing all of that input, synthesizing it, providing their own input, and making recommendations to the tag. The tag's more public facing somewhat responsibility will be to review the draft code provisions that come out of the code development working group, and also assist in informing responses once the draft code goes for public comment. So as we get it out there for public comment and get those comments in, helping, you know, ICC and MBI and the technical team and the code development working group come up with what those responses should be. And then looking ahead to kind of the final phases of the project, we do have a whole range of education sessions that we're planning for the final phase to roll this out, as well as outreach materials. There's implementation resources. So the EAP will be looking at that with an equity focus. So what if that education needs to either focus on disadvantaged communities or bring their perspective to other groups? Same with the outreach materials. How can those help, you know, increase understanding of the perspectives of these communities? Whereas the tag is going to focus in terms of their recommendations for the education and for implementation resources and outreach materials, more on the perspectives of the building departments and the industry itself. So they're similar in a way, but there's some very, very distinct differences in how they operate. So before I go into our brainstorm, any questions here or thoughts here, folks? And I'm seeing lots of really good ideas pop up in the chat. Thank you, Mark and Shay and others. Brianna, you've got a question or comment?
Yeah, just a question, and particularly for the equity advisory group, what do you expect to be kind of the time commitment and for how long for this one?
So what we have committed to in terms of the SOPO for DOE, it's actually the same for both committees. It is at least 15 meetings over the span of about 30 months. So in order to give us the flexibility of having an opportunity for a few extra meetings, we're really looking at a cadence of about every 7 weeks, so not quite bi-monthly. And we haven't pinned down like the overall time commitment in terms of meetings. David Longoria with LISC is really the point of contact and lead for the equity panel. Kevin is the lead for the tag. So they and I are kind of small group figuring out these details. But just my personal thoughts is I don't think we could go less than an hour and a half, and we might think about more like 2 hours for the meetings. So, but I'm open to other people's perspectives on that. Does that help, Brianne?
Yeah, that's great. And one follow-up, again, for the EAP, well, or either group maybe, but mostly for the EAP in my mind, looking at sort of their roles and thinking about this, do you have a sense of whether these should or will be folks who have direct experience, you know, as potential folks who have lived in marginalized communities, identify as being part of marginalized communities, or more along the lines of folks whose jobs already have them working with marginalized communities, more on like sort of CBO end of things?
So I'm gonna, with respect to the EAP, I'm gonna kick that question to David. David, you want to hop on and share what your thinking is about that for the EAP?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Leslie, and thank you, Brian, for the question. I think from our perspective, it would be more helpful and more generative if we had folks who are members of marginalized communities, folks who live within marginalized communities, in a way to gain the knowledge from their lived experience and how the built environment is affecting their lives and the lives of their neighbors and fellow community members. I think we're going to get much more richer content with respect to and feedback with respect to some of the recommendations that we're trying to collect. We're not opposed, I don't think, to having folks from CBOs, for instance, or those who work with marginalized communities take part, certainly, but I think the emphasis should be on the lived experience of those who are in underserved areas.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
All right. And Kevin, did you want to share your thoughts about the tag real quick?
Anything in particular about the tag? I think in general, I can say we're thinking 10 to 20 members, depending on how, the type of stakeholders that we get involved. There are a few deliverables, but obviously the Regional Resilience Code is the final deliverable, as well as the Net Zero Roadmap and an implementation guide. So, are there any particulars that you would like me to cover, Leslie?
Well, Brian was just getting at like the kinds of expertise, and with the EAP, it's from conversations I've had with David, it's less about them being building experts and more just about being able to represent their communities and having general expertise that can support the process. Whereas the tag, I think we want people who have knowledge, maybe not extensive knowledge of the codes, but knowledge of design, knowledge of construction, that are part of the industry, or are part of the technological innovation around that. And I think we had talked about having a balance between local representation, because we really want to make sure we've got people on the tag that have the experience of doing this kind of construction here in our region, as well as folks more from a national perspective that bring, not necessarily bigger picture thinking, but awareness and maybe exposure to things that are different or more innovative and can bring those broader ideas to the table.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I think, there is a subcommittee. I think committee is the word we decided on. Or was it another group? The code writing group.
Yeah, it's another group with a little
Um,
bit of overlap.
Yeah, which will have some overlap developing the actual code, but the tag itself, we'd like to have a broad set of stakeholders working on the code concept level and then translating that into code language at a later point with the code development working group. And the way that the tag and the EAP interact is, I think it's still a question that we're working through. And Leslie and I mean, we've talked about having someone act as a liaison, and it depends on what the composition will actually be. And we should know that in just a few months. So, yeah.
Right. And speaking of composition, excellent segue into we're going to do a brainstorming exercise, which is why I didn't do this in full PowerPoint mode, because I can't access my sticky notes quite as easily. So here's where turn on your mics, even if you don't want to turn on your camera. And I want to hear from you all about what you'd like to see in terms of criteria, selection criteria for the two advisory groups. And we're going to start with the EAP and then move on to the tag. But if you happen to go, no, I want to say something about the tag, we're just doing different sticky note colors. And I just threw in some kind of general things to maybe think about, like, it could be the characteristics of the overall committee, like a balance between, some characteristic or expertise. Like I just mentioned, we could have, balance, let's see, balance between local and national expertise, experience. That's one we just talked about, and you're going to have to deal with my typos. David had mentioned, it as a preference, EAP would be members of marginalized communities. And that's with lived experience. So it can be the committee as a whole, or it could be characteristics that the members should have, or that it would just be preferable to have. So I'm just going to do sticky notes, and I'm going to record what you guys think. So what kind of criteria do you want to be used to determine, when we go through this application process, how to prioritize who's on the committee? And Mark, to your question, it could be Habitat for Humanity. I mean, if you've got specific organizations that you want to have included. At this point, though, we're trying to get at, like, what is it that Habitat brings, or an organization like that brings, that you want represented on one or the other committee, and how does that translate into the whomever is going to be involved in the selection process, saying that this is ultimately who we want in this committee because this meets the needs of the steering committee.
If I could, Leslie, I would just like to, say to members of the steering committee to consider some of the constituencies that you represent in your everyday work, in your particular geographies, and what are the folks that you might want to see represented on the EAP. What does it look like to you? Think about it in those terms, and and provide examples of that if you need help with suggestions or prompts.
Yeah, that's a very good point, David. Because you all work, I'm just going to throw another one for EAP. So geographic balance. We want to make sure all the geographies are represented. But think about the organizations you work with. We are going to ask you to share the invitation to nominate with your stakeholders, both for the EAP and the tag. And that's why we want to get your feedback on, how do we, as we get all of these in, make that selection? And I will start calling on people if I don't hear. Nina.
That geographic balance made me think of a balance between rural and urban for the EAP.
Perfect. That's a good one.
And I think you outlined it about training and things, but I know when we did our solar for low income program, there was a definite lack of understanding of how energy systems even work. And so for them to kind of understand what is energy related or what is efficiency or what is heat, like they can talk about lived experience, but there needs to kind of be certainly a good support for them for understanding and kind of explaining some things. I mean, we want initial input before it's biased by, others' views, but I'm just saying that's definitely going to have support for that EAP to kind of explain how, how heat escapes through, because of lack of air tightness and things like that, about leaving windows open and things, so.
All right.
This is Greg Kinkle with Quest. I think because the EAP will be setting a lot of our goals that we have to implement, I think having a good balance between understanding or living in the marginalized communities, but also having that strong experience and resilience and the goals that we're trying to identify so that we really get to those in the communities. So I think having members who have lots of exposure or lots of experience or lots of connections in the marginalized communities might get us some of those expertise and also be getting the input from those marginalized communities as well. Sorry, that was a lot of like random stuff together, but
No, but what I'm hearing from you, Greg, I think, just to make sure, is balance between the lived experience part of it and actual expertise on the committee.
yeah, we could have a very experienced team that doesn't take into consideration what is happening in the marginalized communities, but we could also come in and have too heavy on marginalized communities and them not understand what we're actually trying to set goals, and our goals become too vague or too big picture and we can't actually implement those. So having a good balance, and I think finding people that I think it's better to have people that are balanced in both of those than necessarily having two groups of those. I guess that's what I would say, is having balanced people, but I think that's what the gentleman before me said.
Laura, I know that equitable outreach was something that was really important to you. I told you I want to put people on the spot. What are your thoughts for that equitable representation? What kind of criteria are you thinking?
I really like the comments that have been made with regard to lived experience and actual experience balancing rural and urban. I wonder if, well, I just think it's and of the geography. So I think the big ones for me have been listed, because how are these groups going to come together virtually like this, or do you envision them doing in person? That may be something you figure out later, but I think the comments that you have so far are really good for the EAP.
I mean, I had envisioned virtually for this, just because of like the broad geographies we're trying to represent. But I think there's gonna be some aspects that, David, you had desired to have be in person.
Yeah, I think there's virtually no other way to do it other than um, virtually, at least at the onset. I don't think we can avoid that. And certainly to make it as easily accessible as possible for as many folks as possible to participate. But we would, we would love to be able during the course of these, 30 months or so that we are planning on holding not only these meetings, but community meetings to the degree that we have the opportunity to engage folks in person. We definitely want to do that. We want to push for that as much as we can. It's just a matter of really planning well logistically for that.
Very good. Thank you.
I'm getting some good comments in the chat. Feel free if you don't feel like putting it out there verbally, put it in the chat. Brianne noted Spanish speaking representation, which I think could be really valuable, especially when we start talking about those community resources and the kinds of things that we're going to put on the website. Having someone who can help figure out how to better reach communities that are predominantly Spanish speaking. I'm also seeing a really good one representation or perspectives based on occupancy type, which I know for the building folks in the room, I'm not using that term correctly, but basically, they're saying, renter, homeowner, business owner, et cetera, kinds. And that is, I think that's a valuable distinction. Shay threw in there, let's see.
I know others in every jurisdiction are at least familiar and aware of the political elements there, but somebody that I think the committee as a whole, if it wants to make a significant impact, is going to be looking for somebody that understands policy and the involvement to network and make things happen outside of the committee as well.
That's a really good point, John, and I think it goes to something that I'm not sure who put it out there. I think maybe Shay. Yeah. A balance between practitioners and policymakers. And for you, it's not necessarily just policymakers, but understanders kind of thing. Other good ones in the chat. Yeah. So we want cultural and ethnic diversity. That's a good one. Getting some good specifics. Representation of unhoused. Yes. I think, we've talked a lot about, geographic and ethnic, cultural, kind of the demographic. Another one is, do we want to think about, there's various other kinds of representations that maybe are less obvious. Brian suggested unhoused. Another one could be disabled, because how buildings are built also have, I think I saw in something you said, David, women. So I think there's, I think these are harder to talk about balanced representation. But maybe ask the question of how to have perspectives of these other, I think seniors is another good category. you know, with only 5 to 12, we're not going to be able to necessarily have individuals with every single one of these, but how do we get some of these other perspectives represented? Mark?
I was gonna switch over to tag. I don't know, do you want me to hold
Okay.
off on that?
Nope, nope. If you're thinking about it,
I
throw
want
it
to
in
say
here.
a general, you know, the tough part of the tag group is understanding the practical, like from, you know, electricians and plumbers, and I really like that idea, people who can really implement. And the issue is there's often, or even the policy side people who are setting the policies, but there's also needs to be a pull of people who are saying, if you had to do it, how would you do it? And using their expertise to really move the dial instead of just creating barriers. Like, for example, in a building code person, if you said, oh, you want to use, you know, reuse water from captured rainwater or something for drinking fountains, and they'd say, oh, no, you can't do that. You know, you can't do it within the code. And it's like, well, but if the state signed off on it, oh, well, then yes, you know, so it really is about having sort of representation there that can really pull the group to say, if you had to do this, how would you go about doing it? And so that they're using their expertise as electricians or plumbers or those to figure out solutions that's practical in the real world. And you kind of need both those mixes, but it's going to really how do you have that group have that vision to say, let's create something? I think that's going to be the tough part of this.
Yes. Very, very, very good point. Greg, guess you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what you said before, Leslie, is you know, trying to find different perspectives, but we also have a very tight number of people that were allowed in there. So I think maybe one of the goals should be having preference to candidates that are multifaceted or cover multiple areas. So if they could, you know, they're from marginalized communities, but also work in some type of development or women-owned small businesses, but trying to get people that cover multiple things so that we can get more out of the limited people that we have inside of there. And I think that will also get stronger candidates because we'll have people that come from different backgrounds, but also have strong education in those. So I think maybe putting that as a preference when we see people with more aspects on there, I think it helps. And I know we're not laying out candidates, but I know I've worked with like Native American Connections in the past. So it's like a great organization that has people that are working with a group, but are also working in development and also in construction and just have a lot of different backgrounds. So giving preference to, I think, candidates like that would be really helpful.
Great point. Great. And feel free, we've got a lot of great criteria for EAP, so feel free to switch over to tag. That's why I've got 2 different colors for Post-it notes. Clayton.
Yeah, just to play off of those comments and some of the other things I've heard, you know, architecture experience is going to have a strong benefit to the conversation, but I would also challenge that we don't necessarily just want architecture experience. We don't want, you know, a perspective of this is how we've been building for the past 20 years. We want a perspective of this perhaps was done 100 years ago before we had air conditioning. So, you know, what architectural experience can we glean from, you know, native Southwestern, you know, tribal experience for, you know, historical Old Pueblo, Mediterranean style design, with a focus on more passive solutions. You know, what can we do with passive regulations to improve active systems? And you know, from the concept of in practice, also I would you know, encourage preference to, say, energy auditors, folks that have experience going into existing buildings and helping people identify where their energy issues are focused on. I believe that would also benefit. And then, you know, folks outside of the built environment that also have strong interest in passive solutions locally. You know, the watershed management group comes to mind, and others that work, you know, more outside the building than inside.
And those both sounded like they were more along the lines of the tag.
Yes, yeah, sorry, I should have prefaced that. I was
No,
speaking
that's
all
okay.
towards the tag.
Just getting clarity. All right, we're down to 3 minutes left. Please continue to mull this over. Kevin, David, and I are meeting Tuesday, and I'm more than happy to incorporate any other feedback you have between now and then, put it in the chat, send me an email, et cetera, et cetera. But I did want to, just with the last couple minutes left, kind of give you an overview of kind of the process that we're going to do. So we are doing an application process. David, Kevin, and I are going to work on an invitation to nominate. So we're just giving organizations an opportunity to nominate members. We're gonna try to get that done quickly enough to send it out for you guys to take a look at. Our goal is to get invitations out August 5th. We will send them to everyone on the steering committee, and feel free to share those invitations with relevant local stakeholders. So if you, for example, have worked with equity groups as part of, your climate action plan or some other process, and you've built relationships and you want to make sure that they have an opportunity to at least be considered for the EAP, or you've got local development stakeholders that you think would be interested in, having an opportunity to sit on the tag, please forward the invitation out to them. We're going to give through the end of August for folks to submit those nominations. And then we're going to make selections by the middle of September. Really quick turnaround, with the goal of having confirmations sent out to everyone who is selected for the committees, along with the meeting schedule, meeting appointments, by the 20th of September. That gives us about a month before the first plan meeting on October 22nd. So if you are interested in assisting with the selection process, say so in the chat, please, or raise your hand real quick, or just shoot me an email. We'll probably pull strongly from the core team for that selection body, but we want to give all of you the opportunity to be part of the selection process if you'd like. And then really quick, with my less than minute left, I'm not going to go into detail on this, but I just want to give you a heads up. I mentioned this earlier. Now that the award's in place, this is going to start moving. So we're planning out the meetings for both the steering committee as well as the EAP and the tag, for not just the rest of the year, but into next year. So we're working on a project calendar, but I just wanted to put out here, and feel free to take a look back at this when I send this out with the notes, kind of what's coming up at individual meetings. There's going to be a lot more participation from you all, and we really hope to see you all, there and engaged, especially once we start getting into the EAP and the tag meeting at the same time. So things are getting rolling, folks, finally. All right, it is 2:00 on the dot. I want to thank you all. It's been a great conversation. Again, feel free to continue to put things in the chat. I'll leave this up for a little bit. Send me an email or reach out otherwise, and I'll send out notes after the call.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.